Welcome to Stories from the Back with Jan, a quiet place for families, educators and experts to come together and build confident learners from the very beginning. I'm Jan, let's begin. Welcome to episode 5, More Than Just a Story. Have you ever noticed how children ask for the same story again and again? Not for a few days, not even a few weeks, and sometimes for months, maybe sometimes for years. And perhaps the curious thing is that they already know exactly what happens next. They know the characters, they know the favourite parts, they know how it ends, and sometimes they even know the words better than we do. So why do they keep on coming back? Today, I'd love to explore what stories do for children and why familiarity can sometimes be as powerful as novelty, and why a favourite story may be doing far more than simply entertaining. Welcome to Stories from the Mat with Jan. I'm Jan Falconer, a children's author, wife, mother, sister, aunt and grandmother, and I suppose I'm someone who's spent a mighty lot of time, most of her life actually, watching children learn. Lately, I've found myself thinking about stories, not books, not screens, not technologies, but stories. Perhaps that's because I've been watching my grandchildren. You know how children sometimes become completely attached to a story? Not for a while, and I'd say but for years. And what fascinates me is that it doesn't seem to matter that they already know exactly what is going to happen. In fact, sometimes I think that's the point. I have a grandson who loves the story Stickman by Dame Julia Donaldson. In fact, we've read it so many times that I would probably perform the thing without opening the book. But interestingly enough, he knows the story. It's what happens because he knows the story. He knows it inside out, upside down and back to front. He smiles at certain parts. He joins in favourite phrases. Sometimes he looks at me with that expression that seems to say, "Don't worry, Nonna, I know this bit." And that has made me wonder whether we sometimes misunderstand what children are doing when they return to the same stories. Because from the outside, it can look as though nothing new is happening. The child already knows the ending. They already know the characters, and they already know what comes next. And yet, they come back again and again and again. Not because they've forgotten, perhaps because something else is happening. As adults, we often assume that learning comes from novelty, new books, new experiences, new information. Yet children seem to understand something that sometimes we forget. There is value in returning. This is value in familiarity, and there is value in knowing what comes next. And if you think about it, many of us do the same thing. We revisit favourite films, we listen to favourite music we already know, we return to places that feel so familiar. There is something really reassuring about recognising where we are and understanding what comes next. Children seem to understand that instinctively. We've spoken before about Kathy Hirsh-Pasek and her work on how children learn. Now, one thing I like about her research is it reminds us that children learn best when experiences are active, engaging, meaningful, and socially interactive and joyful. And when I watch a child sharing a favourite story with a parent, a grandparent, or a trusted adult, I can see all of those things happening all at once. And what I've noticed is the child isn't simply listening anymore. They're predicting what might happen next. They're anticipating their favourite moments. They're joining in with familiar phrases and they're making connections. Sometimes they're even becoming part of the storytelling themselves. And perhaps most importantly, they're sharing an experience with someone they really trust. The story becomes more than entertainment. It becomes an active learning experience. What I find interesting is that many of the ideas researchers describe today are things parents and grandparents quietly observed for generations. Children learn in relationships. They learn through shared experiences and they learn by doing things together. That idea isn't new. Nearly 100 years ago, the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky was exploring how children learn through interaction with other people. One of the most influential ideas was that children can do more with support than they can do alone. And what fascinates me is that nearly a century later, we're still seeing the evidence of that idea everywhere. When a child sits down with a trusted adult and shares a story, they're not just learning in isolation. The adult helps them notice things, understand new words, make predictions, and ask questions, and gradually, often without anybody noticing, the child begins to do more and more of this independently. What they can do with support today, they may well be doing alone tomorrow, just on their own. Isn't that amazing? That reminds me of another thinker whose work I have found really helpful. This is Jerome Bruner. Bruner spent much of his career exploring how children make sense of the world. And what I like about his work is he recognised something many of us instinctively understand. Stories help us organise experience. Stories help us create meaning, and it's stories that helps us make sense of what's happening around us. In other words, stories are not simply something we enjoy. They are often the ways that we learn how life works. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why certain stories stay with us. They help children make sense of events, relationships, feelings, and consequences. They provide a structure that children can return to again and again, often finding something slightly different each time. And perhaps this is where books, stories, and carefully chosen screen content has more in common than we sometimes realise. The issue isn't whether something appears on paper or on a screen. The issue is what kind of experience it creates. Does it invite participation, or does it encourage prediction? Does it create opportunities for a conversation? Does it help a child build meaning? Does it strengthen a relationship? Because when it does all of those things, it becomes more than just a story. It becomes part of how children learn about language, relationships, confidence, and the world around them. And perhaps that's why children return to certain stories again and again and again. Not because they've forgotten them, but because each return allows them to participate a little more fully. Perhaps they notice something new. Perhaps they understand something differently. Or perhaps they simply enjoy being part of a story they know and they love so much. Which raises another question. Why do children ask for the same story over and over and over again? And that's what I'd love to explore next time. This has been Stories from the Mat with Jan, a quiet place to think, notice and begin. So thank you for joining me. Until the next time, take care.